It's funny. I was trying to think about why we laugh at the loathsome douchebag character,
Yes, I love those.
and why would we find that person funny?
I think it's need. I think it's a need. I think we know how people.
Your mic is cutting out. I can't hear you.
Oh, okay. I spent. You hear me now? You hear me?
Yeah.
Whatever
Hold
kind
on
of.
one second. Hold on one second.
Sure.
Ben, could you just check this if there's anything else running on the computer that's causing that? Says Eric, you don't have music playing in the background, right?
I actually do. There is. I'm actually in an office, and the
Oh, okay. So
monitor.
that's what we're hearing. Okay, okay.
I realized this whole time the monitor in this office was actually up, and I could have just turned it off and it would have heard less music. Yeah, so as people rehearsing on stage, you're actually hearing it in this
No, no,
office.
no, no problem, no problem. Okay, that's okay. That's want to make sure if there was something was actually. No,
No, I'm sorry. I just realized the monitor is
no,
broken.
that's absolutely fine because that's in situ. If it would be another thing if there was another window open behind your call,
No, no. I'm
that
at
would
the
be
Kirk Douglas
embarrassing to me.
Theater.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
we're
okay,
workshopping a play at the Kirk Douglas Theater. They're rehearsing on stage, and the monitors were
Right.
up in this office.
and not that porno theater you said you were working in. Gotcha.
Yeah,
Okay. So,
that's down the street. That's my night job.
Right.
like Dan Fielding on Night Court, greatest
Yes. Yeah. Oh
comic
my god.
performance of John Larroquette, greatest comic performance of all time, year on year. So
And
why
I
is
think
it?
part of it is that he's so persistent, and also that he's so ridiculous. If Dan Fielding sexually assaulted somebody, he'd stop being funny really quickly. But it's that he always takes it right to the line. He tries to make love, he tries, but he never forces it beyond a point that actually turns into something we have to find uncomfortable. It's again that just walking right up the line.
What's the interesting thing about a character like that is that you see him develop over time, and there are moments where you see him as, for example, scamming to steal someone's, finding an apartment and going through all the obituaries, forcing his homeless slave to give blood to pay for his.
I
For,
forgot
for,
about that one. Yes, yes, yes.
oh, who could forget that one? Referring to the destroyed Oklahoma couple as Mom and Pa Kettle. I mean, just this absolutely just brutal. I mean, just Reinhold Weege writing at his absolute best, and
Yeah,
it's
and sometimes there's the release. There's also this great thing about comedy, and it's also true of tragedy, of the vicarious thrill. A person is saying the thing that you could never actually say, and they're kind of transgressive in a way that you can't be transgressive.
Yeah.
But the key to that is that their transgression can't actually lead to success. And so like Dan Fielding never actually, usually in these situations, their
fails.
transgressions end up falling apart. It doesn't quite work. Again, Basil Fawlty is a classic example. The Jessica Walter on Arrested Development, sort of saying horrible things, but sort of fundamentally being ridiculous. Joe Bluth is another great. I mean, Arrested Development is to me the funniest show in the last 30 years. Um, this idea that like they can say transgressive things, but it's not gonna. But also we get to then enjoy the fact that they're lying, that it's not working out for them.
But at
The
the
same
same
way.
time, though, at the same time, you have a whole other tradition of comedy, which is the tradition of the new comedy that someone like Buster Keaton very much embodies, or a film like *Romancing the Stone*, where, as what did Byron say? What is a comedy? A comedy is something that ends in a marriage. There's a very strong fertility ritual aspect to comedy, all the way from beginnings of comedy, that involves the fact that of a restabilization of the family and a restabilization of fecundity. And the joke on fecundity is a big one, a big in sex comedy, be it in Decameron or in Chaucer. And it's why, for example, the old man and the young woman is a continuously ridiculed concept in comedy. Because, and not just because of the power imbalance. In fact, it's not the power imbalance when you see in someone like Chaucer and the Decameron, or even the Arabian Nights. Would you see like all the Pasolini films, basically? But when you actually read the text too, I mean, it's not the power imbalance of the issue; it's the lack of virility. Is that a young woman should be with a young man because they'd be more fertile? And
Right.
this is also, I think, very interesting. Like, the fact is that to a certain extent, some comedies have to end in success.
I think that's a really good point, and that's obviously the thing. Shakespeare. The thing about reading any Shakespearean comedy is that, the difference between a Shakespearean comedy and a tragedy is really that In a Shakespearean comedy, the world starts broken and ends fixed. In a tragedy, the world starts fixed and ends broken. On a really super reductive level, that's kind of what happens. But they both take us for a ride. So I do think there is that idea. But what I love about Malvolio. Malvolio in Twelfth Night is a great example of a
Yes.
character
Greatest.
who comes on, who is superior and arrogant and condescending and insufferable, and is brought and humbled through the play. Shylock, also, that is the same humorous model for Shylock. Why is Shylock less funny? Because it's all done at the expense of his Jewishness. Whereas Malvolio is never done at the expense of anything but his own inherent horribleness. With Shylock,
Well, hold on. It's also being a Puritan. I mean, Shakespeare is making a very political point with Malvolio.
Malvolio is a Puritan. You're right. Malvolio is a Puritan. But that's all. That never goes out of style. Being funny. Midsummer is like one of those plays you can't break, no matter how much you try to break it. You can't. Like I always say that like Into the Woods is like Sondheim's Midsummer Night's Dream, right? You can't break those plays.
Yeah.
You put them on, they're gonna work. It's gonna be fine. You can be the just absolute garbage cast. That play within a play starts, it's gonna work.
But again, you bring up Into the Woods, for example, and it's famous. It's Sondheim's famous for his extremely commercially friendly first acts and extremely commercially unfriendly second acts, which we see in Into the Woods, where again everything that seemed to be going well in the first act is going particularly badly in the second act.
Well, and that's the genius of that play, is that it bends in the first act and it breaks in the second act.
So then, at what point in time something stopped being? At what point in time something become horror?
Well, I mentioned Noel Carroll's essay Horror and Humor. Again, when something breaks down our basic categories we use to structure the world, but we experience it as threatening. And even if it's mock threatening, like in a theater, right? Mm-hmm. Or watching a film, you forget that it's a film when you're watching. Or still it's presented in such a way that it's a threat, as opposed to being when it's not a threat to you. Mm-hmm. When there's incongruous elements, and then it can be experienced pleasurably. That is to say, fun, it makes you laugh.
For example, body mutilation.
Right.
Body mutilation is constantly used in humor. I mean, think about Beetlejuice, any of them, or thinking about, things that are really genuine, or even like have been a variety of, cheerleader or zombie films.
Frankenhooker.
My God, that is one of the greatest movies of all time. I can't believe you mentioned that film.
I haven't seen it in ages, but I remember really enjoying it.
Oh my God, that movie is so good, Frankenhooker. Oh, you can't. That director, the guy who made Basket Case too. Oh, that guy.
I love Basket Case.
You can't. That's a cinema that doesn't exist anymore.
Maniac Cop is another one. Maniac Cop and why am I drawing a blank of the director's name? I literally just watched it 2 days ago. Maniac Cop is a classic. It is funny, and it's interesting though, because I keep saying it's funny, which is sort of ironic. That it's also true that what is horror to one generation can be comedy to the next.
Yes.
I think that as tastes evolve, when we see
the Corman films.
Yeah. Or even the classic slashers of the 70s. I mean, if you watch, if you watch Prom Night now, which is a great slasher movie, it's kind of hysterical. It's pretty funny. It's pretty ridiculous. The scares are there, but it's sort of like removed of its threat because you kind of know they're coming, and you can just mock the sort of absurd conventions of it. So I think there is also this idea that as time passes, familiarity can turn kind of horror into comedy as well. That once you become kind of I've seen something in our sort of denudative. It's also a way to respond to fear.
Reefer Madness, it wasn't directed to be a comedy, but whole generations now, you get stoned and you watch it and you can't stop laughing. That's a perfect example of something that changed from something that's into something that's completely hilarious.
So then, what is it that makes it funny? What has changed in its structure? What has changed semantically for you to look at Reefer Madness today and go, "That's funny"? I suspect they did it. I suspect from the second it came out, people were laughing at it while smoking pot. I think it's always been fun. On that sense.
Right. That's funny. Now I can't imagine any time anyone watching that film and it's not hilarious.
It's like watching Fallout films. Like if that nuclear bomb comes, get under your desk and throw a white sheet over yourself, and you'll be fine.
Atomic Cafe. Yeah.
Right. Sure. But it wasn't done originally, right? I mean,
Yeah.
but yeah, at the same time, I can't. There's no era I can imagine a person not laughing hysterically and watching that.
Okay,
Yeah,
I'll give
although
you.
I do think that as people became more comfortable, like if you imagine Reefer Madness in a world where consuming weed was much more was only done by a smaller
Mhm.
segment of the population,
Jazz
you
singers
know,
and Negroes.
so to speak. There were some Jews. I guess we were the jazz singers. Then there were jazz singers with blackface, which is a horrible combination of the two. I think that
Which did not involve weed. It involves a lot of liquor, though. A lot of
a
corn
lot of
whiskey.
liquor.
A lot of
Yeah,
corn
I
whiskey.
think that people might have just had such ignorance on the subject that they might have watched it seriously. And then as people became more, what makes it funny is the absurdity of it, is the incongruity of the fact that none of what they're showing is actually representative of the behavior people are familiar with when they engage in this behavior. So it just looks like what you're laughing at is you're laughing at the filmmaker's lack of comprehension of their subject matter.
Right, right. It is true. It is true. It has those. I mean, on the one hand, that is part of what you're laughing at. You're laughing at whoever put, like the idiot who put this film together. Who's trying to scare us away from this horrible, the devil's weed, whatever they called it. That's part of the reason why we're laughing. We're laughing at the people who put it together. But at the same time, you also mentioned the other thing, the incongruity. It's like the rich contrast.
So,
And part of that is a form of superiority. On May the 4th, it's become the joke, May the 4th be with you, right? Everyone knows it's Star Trek Day. But now there's people on social media who are like, oh, it's not Star Trek Day, it's Dave Brubeck Day, because of the 5-4. Now, those people are pretentious nits, but they think it's funny. And what's funny about that isn't the actual joke. What's funny is that you get the joke. It's humor of superiority. It's like it's the nerd Reich. It's humor of superiority that's laughing at people who don't understand the joke, and you are laughing to assert yourself as a person who's in on the joke.
Yeah.
And I think that's a lot of it too. Is like you're laughing. It's also like why people laugh when other people laugh.
Yeah.
Because the last thing you want to do is be a person who doesn't get it.
Right.
So it's. I mean, we watch a lot of classic cinema in movie theaters because we're pretentious California people. And it is maddening.
also, you can do it in Los Angeles. You really can't do that in New York anymore the way you used to.
Yeah, they open up the big movie theaters every year. It's great. The big movie palaces. It's fantastic, actually. But they'll show these movies and they'll show these heartbreaking moments, and because a few people laugh, the laugh becomes kind of contagious.
Yeah.
And it is completely at odds with anything that is happening in the movie, or even the intention of the filmmaker, or even whether that moment is actually funny. But people laugh, because I think sometimes people laugh nowadays because they're uncomfortable with too much genuine feeling. Like a lot of those movies are so earnest that earnestness makes us laugh because it is uncomfortable for us to be that vulnerable. And I think there's also the sense of smug superiority of like, look how silly they were, look how silly they are.
Loser, they're in love.
Yeah, right, exactly. So it's interesting. But I do think there is that also that like Ep was saying, the comedy superiority has fallen from vogue. I would say that just what it means to be superior has changed. That being superior now is a much more sort of nuanced concept.
Well, I think there's also a sense of community. I think when you get when you're in with the in joke, you're in with the in crowd. You do what the in crowd does. You're in with the in crowd. You need. It's not that song. I'm sorry. Anyhow, point is that I think there is a sense of comedy is also a sense of community. That I think it's very hard to punch someone that just made you laugh. And
people have done it to me, but very rarely.
You're funny.
Punch, yeah. In high school, all the time. But yeah, it is, and look, I use that all the time. Like I use humor in my incredibly non-funny job. I mean, I love my job. I do great work. I enjoy it. Sam and I had a great conversation about theater. I love what I do. But it's not my job isn't to be funny. But I use humor all the time, and largely it's because I have to say things that might be challenging or that might kind of we're dealing with sort of high stakes situations, or we're dealing with situations where high stakes. I mean, theater high stakes. No one's gonna fucking die, but money's getting spent. And there is a certain heightened tension that emerges, and comedy is just a way to kind of release that, and also a way to get people to feel like, it's harder to shoot the messenger when the messenger's wearing. It's harder to shoot the messenger when the messenger's wearing a clown hat.
No, I don't. I'm not particularly worried about human nature changing. That's something I think is actually human beings remain reliably, indolent and incompetent enough to maintain any sense of freedom we have.
Yeah.
Thankfully, I mean, I used to say in Italy, what was it? Liberty through incompetence.
Right.
I mean, it is a joy for human beings to be as absolutely inefficient as we are. I just think that at this current moment, that we are under a level of cultural control that we ourselves are not even willing to yet admit to ourselves.
No, I spend a little too much time on X than I should, and however that can gauge the culture that we're living in, there's awareness of the hypersensitive time we live in.
I'm not saying hyper. I don't mean hypersensitive. I don't think honestly. I don't think we're all that hypersensitive per se. I don't think honestly. I mean, I don't have a problem with people being aware of causing offense or not. I mean, like for example, there are certain things that you could. I can't see anyone making a good kitten strangling joke anymore. I mean, and if you can't strangle a kitten on stage, where can you strangle a kitten in society? There's a certain type of humor that if you do today, it's not permitted, not because it's offensive to anyone or anything per se, but it's offensive to an entire vision of reality, which I think has become extremely and extraordinarily reified. Again, I'll say it straight. I don't think Blazing Spirals could be made today, not because of what it says about race. I think you could probably say all those things today. I think it's all those kinds of things were said into Django Unchained, right? Tarantino says a lot of the kind of stuff that you would say in Blazing Saddles. What's disturbing about Blazing Saddles is that it's a fucking joke. And that they will absolutely that they will absolutely take the most horrific stereotypes that have ever been and put them into an actual historical context, which was a genuine nightmare, and turn it into a laugh riot. And that's disturbing in a way to people. They don't want that. They want to know what their moral position is today. Whereas I think that may have, if this related to anything culturally, it may be the fact that, human beings used to mostly work on farms, so used to see animals killed. So you better learn how to laugh at that. And human beings would go into trench warfare and see other human beings killed. And you kind of have to learn to laugh at that. And then we would see for the first time on television, giant mass bombings of Vietnam. And you got to laugh at that. And at a certain point, if you don't laugh, you cry. And so we are now protected from crying and protected from laughing.
It's just the antiseptic nature of our contemporary life, you're saying.
Absolutely.
So I think that if avoiding trench warfare means that slightly fewer things are funny, I'm kind of fine with that, because trench warfare is pretty horrible.
But think about this for a second. The fact is that the generation that came out of World War I and World War II, particularly even more so than World War I, was willing to make a variety of social compromises and have a society that could both be funny and could develop, and that there was far more willingness to distribute economic growth because they had learned to laugh together, because if they didn't, they would have died in a trench.
It reminds me probably the biggest thing I've ever learned about comedy was not in humor, was not in philosophy of humor stuff. I remember when I was 19 years old, I visited one of my father's precincts, and he and his partners were talking about their cases. And my father was a homicide detective, and they were talking. This is the early '90s, so they were talking about some really horrific things, and they're kind of like making jokes about it. And I said to him, I remember saying to my father, how can you make jokes about this? Where do you find this funny? I sounded like one of today's, generation. What is it now? Y or whatever. What's the new one? I don't know. And he just told me in his language, which was thick Brooklynese. He said, John, you know, if you in our line of work, if you don't have a sense of humor, you end up in Bellevue, you know, and that kind of sort of opened up in my mind that humor is a survival strategy, you know, among
Yeah.
other things.
I I think that it's so interesting because like the generation growing up today has a lot of really traumatic, horrible shit they're dealing with. There might be trench warfare. There sure as hell are school shootings,
Yeah.
and so I
And just seeing
kind of
images on social media.
But notice that the school shootings are excruciatingly atomizing. Like
right.
there's no moment you can all join together in the shoe
This
scooting.
generation seeing
Well,
bombs in
so hold on,
Gaza
I'm
and
getting to
what
a point
have
here.
you.
So I think that it's a couple things. First, I think that when there is a joke about us, the let's say the school shooting being sort of the horrific thing of our time, the joke becomes more about the kind of pathetic response to that by leadership. The thoughts and prayers, this bullshit, or that great Onion headline that's ever repeated. No way to do anything about this. Says the only nation where this constantly happens. So I think that becomes a joke. I think that it is kind of interesting that as a trauma response, comedy has fallen out of vogue. I think that is a really interesting idea that like there was a long time where comedy was kind of a knee jerk trauma response. And I guess what I wonder is whether that impulse to laugh at the thing that is most terrifying to you has fallen out of vogue, or on the flip side, am I just so out of touch with people experiencing these things that it's not safe for them to tell me their jokes about it? Like, are there people who endure these things that find them funny, but they don't see me because I'm older as someone with whom it's to be safe to laugh at about that? So there's that too. Like, I don't know what Gen Alpha or Gen Z are saying when I'm not around because I'm only around. So there might be a much different public or private face than there is a public face. But I think it's also the fact that it's a generation that was raised by parents who really wanted to get it right this time, who really wanted to break cycles of generational trauma and raise their kids without it, and have somehow, despite all their best intentions, fucked it up yet again. Because that's just how it goes. They fuck you up, your mom and dad. So I think that there might also be this idea of kind of, I don't know, maybe discomfort with finding humor as a trauma response. Maybe the idea of not wanting to express that. Maybe that's just not considered. Maybe there's just healthier ways of coping with trauma than humor. Maybe there's all sorts of other possibilities. But it is interesting that as that specific line of humor, you're right. I don't see it happening in that sense. I don't see like climate change jokes being made quite the same, But then again, but again, like maybe they're being made, and I'm just not finding that humor.
Trying to think of a good climate change joke. It's you put me on the spot here. And and not much spot as someone who's water's rising on, but hey.
That's a spot.
No, but it's
why did the chicken cross the road to avoid drowning in Florida? I mean, there's I think that but I think it's like that, and to me, like growing up in the '90s, like I think was the quintessential time of comedy as the response to the horrible.
yes.
But also, like, what horrible things was I really experiencing growing up in the '90s? Like, there's a flip side to that, which is that's kind of an expression of privilege because like there wasn't really anything bad happening to me, so I felt like I could get away with saying horrible stuff. But I do wonder now if you really are faced with the sort of horrific consequences of generational neglect, what do you find funny about that?
Oh, I
And
mean,
I
what
don't know.
don't you find funny
I'm not the
about
person
that?
to
I
answer
mean, God, from 2,000 years ago till today, a man in a dress was funny. And you had men in dresses in Monty Python, and you had men in dresses in Kids in the Hall. And particularly in the case of Kids in the Hall, there is nothing vulgar or even exploitive about the feminine character portrayals in Kids in the Hall. I don't think it would be possible today to put a man in a dress in a comic work and have it be. I mean, I don't even think you could do. One of my favorite films of all times, Victor Victoria.
Yeah.
Victor Victoria, you see that movie, and it is everything about that movie is perfect.
It's a masterclass.
Masters. It can't be made now.
You know, it's interesting because I think that movie is an interesting you bring up that one because that one actually does deal with gender norms in a way that's kind of ahead of its time.
Oh,
In a way that
yes.
Kids in the Hall doesn't. So actually, in some ways, because Victor Victoria is a comedy about bending gender and about how like the smart, wily characters are the ones for whom gender is fluid and can be bent. In some ways, that is more relevant today than like Kids in the Hall or Python, where a man in the dress is just inherently a punchline. Because like what's funny about Victor Victoria is they're in on the joke. The
Yes.
people we empathize are in on the joke. They're in on the joke about gender, and the foolish characters are the ones who see gender as an absolute. It'd be fun to show Victor Victoria to you know a focused group of younger people who've grown up with this and see how they respond to those gender norms being kind of laughed at in that movie.
I would
Because
show
was
it to them
actually
in
more-
kindergarten. I would force children to watch Blake Edwards films for their entirety of their first years of
here's a
school.
question. Here's a question about gender: Victor Victoria versus Tootsie.
Tootsie's a brilliant fucking film.
Both brilliant movies, both brilliantly funny, both very funny. Which one of them, or both, or neither, do you think is makeable or workable today?
Neither of them. Neither, because first of all, the scripts are too smart.
I actually think Victor Victoria holds up better than Tootsie, because Tootsie, so much of the gag in Tootsie is he is an ugly woman. He is a fundamentally unattractive woman. You know, can we zoom back a little further? How about Cleveland? Like so much of the gag in that, or just like he's being pursued by the dad. Whereas I think with Victor Victoria, also because the character's gay, because he's queer, because you know there's the Robert Preston character is already kind of an outsider. There's so much of like I think in Victor Victoria, there's so much of like the outsider getting it over on the straight world.
Oh, yes.
You know, queer worlds. Whereas in Tootsie, it's not. Tootsie's more like he's just a white dude who wants to. Tootsie's like Soul Man. Tootsie's like he's just a white dude who thinks that by being part of a marginalized group, he can get some sort of privilege he's otherwise denied. Whereas Victor, I'm not saying this is what I think. I'm saying this is how you could interpret it. Whereas Victor Victoria is like, oh, the queer folk are getting it over on the straight world. It's like a Yiddish folktale.
Oh, I know.
Holds up better than Tootsie today.
I will not only agree with you on that. I'm just going to point out that the greatest American director that nobody talks about is Blake Edwards, and the run of films he had from the days of Wine and Roses. Excuse me, not even from Pink Panther, from the days of Wine and Roses, all the way through S.O.B., which is one of my favorite films ever made, through the Victor Victoria. I mean, like, it's genuinely underrated.